What would you do if you discovered that the Bible we have today is not complete? What fundamental truths about God, the universe, and even your purpose in life have been deliberately erased or distorted? It seems impossible, doesn't it? But what if I told you that there is proof that entire books have been deleted, secrets have been censored, and narratives have been tweaked to serve powerful interests? And worse, that it still affects what you believe to this day. What is at stake here is much more than religion. We are talking about texts that could completely change the way you see good, evil, and even the meaning of your existence. Why was the fourth book of Ezra, with its bold visions and uncomfortable questions, erased from the official scriptures? What did he know about the fate of humanity that was considered too dangerous to reveal? And most disturbingly, who decided what you should and shouldn't know about God? In this video, you will discover that the Bible, as we know it, may be just one part of the story, and not by chance. Let's explore the lost books, the hidden messages, and the dark intentions behind these omissions. But I will warn you, what you will hear here may shake everything you have ever believed. And in the end, you will have to decide, are you ready for the truth, or would you prefer to continue in the comfort of the official narrative? After all, who benefits from your ignorance? And more importantly, what don't they want you to know? If you're curious, stay with me until the end, because the answer could change your life. At the heart of biblical controversies, few names shine as brightly as Ezra's, a scribe whose pen seemed sharper than any sword. Their texts, partially preserved, raise questions about what the church allowed the world to know. Could it be that, when compiling the 24 canonical books, he kept secrets in lost manuscripts? The possibility that hidden knowledge, perhaps forbidden and even persecuted, has been deliberately omitted is an irresistible invitation to the curious and conspirators. If we look at the post-Babylonian exile period, the cultural and spiritual reconstruction of Israel depended on firm hands like those of Ezra. However, it cannot be ignored that his work with the sacred texts seemed more like that of an astute editor than a mere compiler. Manuscripts, such as the fourth book of Ezra, absent from the canon, bring revelations that, if true, question basic theological narratives. Why was something so vital excluded? Who would be so afraid of the impact of these truths? Modern archaeology also adds fuel to this fire. Texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls and Nag Hammadi prove that the biblical story has layers that have been carefully covered over. If Ezra knew of mystical secrets, Hermetic symbolism, or connections to Sumerian and Egyptian traditions, who could blame him for keeping these discoveries to a tight circle? After all, in those times, censored knowledge was a powerful currency. Now imagine the impact of this on contemporary theology. Who would have the courage to review fundamental concepts such as creation, the nature of God, or even salvation? Ezra, with his controversial actions, may have planted the seed of doubts that still flourish. The intentional omission of books reveals more about human power than about the deity they supposedly served. And so, as we approach new discoveries about Ezra's work, it becomes evident that we are only scratching the surface. What is still hidden in the shadows of ancient times? And more importantly, who is holding the key to this forbidden knowledge? Imagine a lone scribe with parchment scattered across a worn wooden table, trying to order the chaos of human origins. Isn't that how you would imagine Ezra? However, his words suggest something much more unsettling than a simple narrative. While Genesis reassures us with the idea of a single, linear creation, Ezra seems to suggest that the Creator, so to speak, did not finish the job on the first try. The world, in his view, has been recreated, a cycle of destruction and rebirth that defies centuries of conventional theology. What did he know that we don't? Are we living in an endless sequence of beta versions of creation? During the Babylonian exile, Ezra saw a world in ruins. The people of Israel were not just defeated. It was a reflection of a universe that seemed to have been rejected by the factory. It describes a rebuilt humanity, a new beginning after devastation. Curious, right? After all, he lived in a context where Babylonian and Sumerian traditions also spoke of cosmic destruction and recreation. Think of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where capricious gods play at destroying and remaking humanity. Ezra's theology drank from this forbidden source, and it would be impossible not to notice how he incorporated these symbolisms into his narrative. And here's the masterstroke. Ezra not only suggests a second creation, but implies that God, perhaps, has changed his mind about the direction of humanity. Imagine a divine craftsman reviewing his plans like a frustrated programmer restarting code. Could it be that the Creator, in Ezra's view, is closer to a cosmic experiencer than to an omnipotent and infallible being? The irony here is deliciously sarcastic. The God who demands perfection from us may not have gotten it right the first time. Who would dare suggest such a thing? Ezra, it seems. But what about the reconstruction of the Jewish people itself under Ezra? The rebuilding of the temple was not just a spiritual act, but a powerful metaphor for this divine recreation. For Ezra, the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile were not just tragedies, but a purification, a chance to start anew. This vision is not only echoed in Jewish traditions, it reverberates in Hermetic and esoteric philosophies that speak of chaos as the fertile soil for order. The knowledge hidden in these narratives, persecuted and censored for centuries, could completely change the way we understand our relationship with the divine. And how about thinking about the apocryphal books that expand this idea? Many texts rejected by biblical compilers speak of destruction and recreation. Do they reinforce this theory of a God who, instead of creating everything good and perfect at once, opts for a continuous process of adjustments? Could this be the key to understanding the world we live in today? After all, couldn't human failures be a reflection of a universe that is still in the process of improvement? But thinking another way, Ezra forces us to face an uncomfortable question. If creation is cyclical, what does that mean for us? Are we destined to live and relive the same mistakes until we finally learn? Or does, as he suggests, each destruction carry within it the seed of something new? If Kabbalah is the backbone of Jewish mysticism, who better to inspire it than Ezra, a scribe who seemed to have one foot in the spiritual world and the other in religious politics? His writing, seemingly banal to the uninitiated, may contain deep layers of mystical symbolism. And we're not talking about any symbolism, but hermetic patterns, gematria, and even hints about the tree of life. Did Ezra know more about the mysteries of the cosmos than he let on, deliberately hiding this forbidden knowledge? The period in which Ezra lived was permeated by Babylonian, Persian, and Egyptian influences, cultures that already explored esotericism in their own religious systems. In his texts, it is possible to find echoes of concepts that would later be fundamental to Kabbalah, such as the divine spheres and the concept of emanations. Coincidence? Unlikely. Ezra seemed to understand that certain knowledge, if revealed to the general public, could be dangerous or misused. Then, like any good guardian of knowledge, he encoded these secrets into metaphors and images, accessible only to the initiated. Let's get to the curious detail. In the fourth book of Ezra, there are references to 7 heavens, specific angels, and apocalyptic visions that resonate with the structure of the tree of life in Kabbalah. These elements do not appear in other biblical texts so clearly, which makes us wonder, were these passages intentional clues? Perhaps Ezra was drawing a spiritual map disguised as apocalyptic literature, something that could only be understood by those able to read between the lines. The more intriguing question is, why have these connections been ignored or dismissed by traditional theologians? Perhaps because admitting them would mean opening the door to a much broader and less controllable interpretation of the scriptures. It would not be surprising to discover that the persecuted and censored apocryphal books contain exactly these ideas. After all, the power of institutionalized religion has always resided in dictating which knowledge should be accessible and which should remain excluded. If Ezra truly influenced the emergence of Kabbalah, he not only left a profound spiritual legacy, but also planted the seed of an eternal debate. Which is more dangerous, knowledge itself, or who decides who can possess it? This question leads us to another mystery, where the discrepancies between the gods of Ezra and Moses may reveal even more hidden secrets. Between the austere God of Moses and the mysterious divine presented in the texts of Ezra, there is a theological abyss that few dare to explore. While the God of Moses is firm, direct, and often ruthless, the God of Ezra sounds more like a strategist, someone who reconfigures his intentions according to the scenario. Are we dealing with the same creator or with interpretations shaped by the cultures that influenced Ezra? What about the inflexible character of Moses versus a God who seems adaptable in the texts of Ezra? The historical setting cannot be ignored. Moses led his people during a time of exodus and formation, where the law needed to be severe to shape a nation. Ezra appears centuries later in a destroyed Jerusalem with a fragmented and disoriented people. It is here that Ezra presents a God who, curiously, seems more conciliatory, almost pragmatic. Could this be a reflection of Babylonian and Persian influences, which worshipped equally multifaceted gods? The intersection between pagan and Jewish mythologies has never been more evident. Here is the dilemma. If the God of Ezra is the same as Moses, why the differences? A possible explanation lies in the role of each scribe as an interpreter of the divine. Moses wrote to impose order, Ezra to rebuild. There is also the issue of omissions. What did Ezra intentionally leave out when retelling the history of the Jewish people? Perhaps he adapted the divine message to make it more palatable, more political, in an effort to reunite a shattered nation. Add to this the issue of apocryphal texts, which often highlight a much more enigmatic side of God. In some passages in the fourth book of Ezra, God appears almost human, reflecting on the failings of humanity and his own creation. These excerpts never entered the canon, and for good reason. After all, a God who admits flaws does not serve the purposes of religious control well. So the question remains, were Moses and Ezra really describing the same God? Or did the idea of the divine evolve according to the needs of the people? Or, even more disturbing, did Ezra know something that Moses never knew? Perhaps the answer lies in the lost books of Ezra, which may hold even more pieces of this divine puzzle. Now we will explore what exactly was excluded and the impact of this on our understanding of faith. And if you want to know more about these hidden texts, subscribe to the channel. Now imagine being a scribe tasked with recording the spiritual destiny of a nation. Ezra not only accomplished this mission, but he did it in such an enigmatic way that centuries later, we are still trying to decipher it. According to tradition, he wrote 94 sacred books, but mysteriously, only 24 were revealed to the public. What happened to the other 70 volumes? The answer, it seems, lies in layers of occult knowledge, religious censorship, and perhaps sheer fear of the impact such texts could have. To understand this mystery, we need to look at the historical context. Ezra lived at a time when wisdom was carefully protected by religious elites. Not just anyone could access these texts. After all, what could happen if common people had access to truths that challenged official narratives? Some say that these books contain details about the nature of God, the destiny of the soul, and even the secrets of the cosmos. Forbidden, persecuted, excluded knowledge. Doesn't that sound like something that would change the world? Interestingly, the books that have come down to us seem like fragments of something larger. Take as an example the fourth book of Ezra, which mentions a deep dialogue between Ezra and God about the future of humanity. What if the lost volumes expanded on these revelations, perhaps connecting Jewish esotericism with Egyptian and Babylonian traditions? It wouldn't be the first time we've seen parallels with ancient mythologies. Was Ezra trying to warn us about spiritual connections that transcend formal religion? This is where the issue of censorship comes in. The early church, when compiling the Bible, was clearly not interested in disseminating all available texts. After all, an enlightened people are much more difficult to control. What did these 70 books contain that was so dangerous that they needed to be buried under centuries of oblivion? Some scholars believe they detailed advanced spiritual practices or even knowledge that could be considered heretical. Imagine, for example, if there were instructions on how to achieve states of divine enlightenment without religious intermediaries. That would be unacceptable. And then the provocation. If these books still exist, where are they? Perhaps hidden in secret libraries or lost forever. But more importantly, what would be the impact of getting them back? Would we be ready to deal with the truth that Ezra tried to leave us? Or, like so many times before, would we be consumed by fear of the unknown? Now, let's get into the symbolism of the temple rebuilt by Ezra. A spiritual movement or just another control strategy? Imagine a temple in ruins, its stones silent witnesses to centuries of history and glory. Now, visualize Ezra standing among the wreckage with a scroll in one hand and an unwavering purpose in the other. The rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple was not just an architectural act. It was a symbol, but of what exactly? Was it a spiritual rebirth, or was there also a political strategy behind this movement? Ezra, a strategic and perceptive scribe, knew exactly what was at stake. Historical context is essential here. After the Babylonian exile, the Jewish people needed something to unify them. The temple, destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, was more than a building. It was the essence of national and spiritual identity. Ezra used this reconstruction as a catalyst to restore not only faith, but also social control. After all, the temple was not just a place of worship. It was the center of political and economic life. What appears to be a spiritual gesture may well have been a calculated move to consolidate power. But the spiritual symbolism is equally fascinating. The rebuilding of the temple can be seen as a metaphor for the rebirth of the soul after chaos. Ezra, steeped in the hermetic and mystical traditions of his time, was perhaps trying to teach that, like the temple, the human spirit can be rebuilt after destruction. This view is echoed in esoteric traditions, where the temple is not only physical, but also a representation of the body and mind as abodes of the divine. What did Ezra know about these mysteries that led him to undertake such a monumental task? Still, we cannot ignore the political aspect. By rebuilding the temple, Ezra was also reaffirming the authority of the priesthood and, by extension, his own role as scribe and spiritual leader. The manipulation of religious power to control the masses is nothing new. Was Ezra simply re-erecting a symbol of faith or fashioning a system that would ensure the submission of his people? This is where the line between spirituality and control begins to blur, making his intentions even more intriguing. So what was the true purpose behind rebuilding the temple? Was it a fusion of spiritual symbolism with political strategy? Or did Ezra have an even more hidden agenda? Perhaps the temple itself is a reflection of humanity's contradictions, at once a place of divine inspiration and an instrument of earthly control. And speaking of contradictions, can we not fail to explore Ezra's 7 visions? Genuine spiritual experiences or hallucinations induced by mystical practices. Imagine Ezra alone in a desolate field, the sky darkened by heavy clouds as he searches for answers. It is here that, according to his accounts, he was graced with 7 profound visions, each revealing mysteries about creation, human destiny, and the very heart of God. But were these visions so full of enigmatic symbolism, legitimate divine prophecies, or the fruits of intense psycho-spiritual experiences? Was Ezra a prophet or a visionary whose altered states of consciousness revealed something more? The descriptions of his visions are rich in symbolism and almost hallucinatory. He recounts an angel guiding him through spiritual realms, showing hidden truths about humanity and the future. In one of them, Ezra sees a woman who transforms into an entire city, a scenario that echoes the apocalyptic language of biblical literature and that also appears in Hermeticism and Gnosis. Traditional interpretation suggests that this was the direct work of God. But could it be possible that Ezra was exploring mental states induced by mystical practices, perhaps even similar to those used by other ancient cultures? The historical context offers intriguing clues. Mystical and visionary practices were common in Babylonian and Egyptian traditions, with the use of deep meditations, isolation, and, in some cases, entheogenic substances. Did Ezra, influenced by these cultural contexts, apply similar methods? Perhaps he was seeking to transcend the limits of human knowledge to access a reality that was forbidden and excluded from traditional narratives. Could this be the source of what he called divine visions? What about the impact of these views on theology and spirituality? Ezra describes a complexity of worlds and beings that transcend the ordinary biblical narrative, offering a glimpse of an interconnected cosmos, where human destiny is one piece on the great divine board. His views align with esoteric traditions that see existence as multiple layers of realities, an idea that official theology has often persecuted and censored. After all, the more man understands the divine, the less he depends on religious intermediaries. These visions then lead us to an inevitable provocation. What if Ezra was mapping something that humanity is not yet ready to understand? Or maybe, just maybe, he has found a shortcut to access truths that few dare even contemplate. What do these experiences say about the potential of the human spirit? The answer may lie just below, where we explore the connection between Ezra and the moral decay of Babylon, a timeless reflection of the crises we face today. When Ezra speaks of Babylon, he's not limited to a physical place, but a symbol of moral decadence, corruption, and spiritual deviation. For him, Babylon was not just an empire. It was the reflection of a humanity that had lost its connection with the sacred. And here's the disturbing detail. Ezra's criticisms don't sound like an echo of a distant past, but like a disturbing mirror of modern society. Are we living in our own contemporary Babylon, repeating mistakes that he already denounced? Babylon, for Ezra, represented the height of human arrogance, an empire that placed itself above divine laws, trusting in strength and power as the foundations of its glory. He witnessed the price of this pride: ruin, exile, and an almost irreparable spiritual disconnection. Interestingly, the traits he condemns, unbridled greed, flexible morality, and the worship of materialism, are more alive than ever. Replace Babylonian temples with skyscrapers and slave markets with global corporations, and the similarity becomes uncomfortable. But what really differentiated the Babylon described by Ezra? He saw a system that not only tolerated decadence, but actively promoted it. The centralization of power, the censorship of subversive ideas, and the exclusion of dangerous knowledge were common practices. Today, we can ask ourselves, are modern systems of control, political, religious, and even technological, so different? Doesn't the persecution of forbidden and censored knowledge continue, just in more sophisticated forms? Ezra's account also points to a fascinating paradox. Babylon was at once a center of learning and a place of spiritual oppression. Many of the mystical and esoteric traditions that influenced Judaism and other religions came from there. But the elite controlled who could access these truths. Wouldn't this be a direct reflection of what we live in today? With an avalanche of information available, but with few people really understanding or questioning the dominant narratives. Ezra challenges us to reflect. Are we doomed to repeat the cycle of rise and fall, or is there still time to build something different? The morality and spirituality he extolled as an antidote to decadence remain the same tools we need to rediscover. And speaking of tools, let's explore how the church dealt with the fourth book of Ezra and the reasons for its exclusion from the official canon. Get ready for more controversial revelations. If there is something that intrigues scholars and provocateurs on duty, it is the strategic disappearance of certain sacred texts. Among them, The fourth book of Ezra is a classic case. Why has the church, over the centuries, decided to keep it out of the official canon? What is it about this book that could threaten the dominant narrative? After all, it wouldn't be the first time that censored or excluded knowledge was used as a weapon of control, would it? The fourth book of Ezra delves into themes that, to say the least, are uncomfortable. He openly questions human suffering, divine justice, and even the plan of salvation. Ezra, in his interactions with angels and visions of future catastrophes, seems more like a restless thinker than a confirmed prophet. His approach is deeply existential. Why does God allow the righteous to suffer while the wicked prosper? These reflections call into question the idea of a benevolent and controlling God, something that the church has never been very willing to discuss publicly. But that's not all. The book also suggests the existence of divine secrets that were not revealed to everyone, but kept for a select few. This idea of hidden knowledge, accessible only to the initiated, directly echoes the esoteric and hermetic traditions that the church has pursued for centuries. It would not be difficult to imagine why such passages would be seen as dangerous. They encourage readers to seek a direct connection with the divine, without religious intermediaries, a thought too subversive to be allowed. The history of the exclusion of the fourth book of Ezra is also intertwined with political and theological disputes. During the first centuries of Christianity, the church was trying to consolidate its authority. Texts that offered alternative views of God, or that questioned the centrality of the ecclesiastical institution, were naturally left aside. Thus, the fourth book of Ezra was relegated to oblivion in many Christian traditions, although it survived in the margins, used by mystical and Gnostic groups. And now, the final provocation. If the fourth book of Ezra were available to everyone, how would it transform our understanding of God and the universe? Would we be closer to a genuine spirituality, free from imposed dogmas? Or perhaps are we just scratching the surface of something much bigger and more disturbing? The answer may lie in Ezra's revelations about the rebellious angels and the origin of evil, where the controversy promises to grow even more. Among Ezra's visions, one figure stands out like an unsettling shadow: the rebellious angels. These beings, fallen from their celestial glory, appear not as mere supporting characters, but as key pieces in a mystery that spans time. Did Ezra reveal details that were not included in the official narratives about the origin of evil? Or was it just a conduit for censored knowledge, deliberately excluded to prevent uncomfortable questions from being asked? Rebel angels are a recurring theme in several religious traditions. But what makes Ezra's approach unique is its almost philosophical depth. He not only describes the fall of these beings, but speculates about their motivations and the complex relationship between free will and divine creation. Why would God create beings with the ability to disobey? This question, so simple and at the same time so dangerous, echoes in its pages. Was angelic rebellion part of the divine plan or a cosmic failure? The idea of a creator allowing evil to give meaning to good is both fascinating and disturbing. And then comes the question of symbolism. In esoteric and hermetic tradition, fallen angels are often associated with bearers of forbidden knowledge, those who defy divine orders to bring wisdom to humanity. Could this be the implicit reading in Ezra's texts? Perhaps these angels were not just rebels, but bearers of light, defying a deity that preferred to keep certain secrets hidden. Such an idea, of course, was persecuted by the church as heresy, but its presence in Gnostic and Kabbalistic traditions suggests a deeper truth. The impact of these revelations on traditional theology cannot be underestimated. Ezra presents us with a vision of a cosmos where evil is not simply the opposite of good, but a necessary force for balance. It is a perspective that resonates with Eastern ideas of duality and cosmic balance, but which collides head-on with the dominant Judeo-Christian view of a purely benevolent God. Who would have the courage to confront these theological contradictions head-on? Ezra, it seems, was not afraid. When delving into this universe of rebellious angels and unsolved mysteries, we are forced to question, what else was excluded, persecuted, or simply ignored in sacred narratives? And how would these truths impact our understanding of ourselves and the divine? Perhaps the answer lies below, where we will explore Ezra's passages about a new earth, a possible reference to spiritual dimensions or even parallel worlds. Among the most enigmatic passages in Ezra, one in particular stands out: his description of a new earth. When reading his texts, it is impossible not to wonder, was he talking about spiritual renewal, about a physical world that would emerge after destruction, or about something more audacious, dimensions beyond our understanding? The idea of parallel worlds, so fascinating to modern science, was perhaps already encoded in Ezra's writings. What if, in his forbidden wisdom, he had glimpsed a hidden reality, censored by those who preferred to maintain control over knowledge? Ezra describes a land where justice prevails, where human suffering is finally alleviated. This ideal, at once concrete and utopian, resonates deeply with mystical and esoteric traditions. Kabbalah, for example, speaks of spiritual worlds that coexist with ours, and Hermeticism suggests the existence of interconnected planes of reality. Was Ezra, inspired by Babylonian or Egyptian influences, able to translate these concepts into his prophetic vision? Could the new earth actually be a glimpse of these other plans? The symbolism present in his words cannot be ignored either. The idea of a renewed earth can be understood as a metaphor for spiritual evolution, an internal transformation that leads the individual to transcend their mundane existence. However, if we read carefully, his descriptions seem to go beyond the metaphorical, suggesting a literal and cosmic change. Apocryphal texts reinforce this idea, mentioning realms of light and spheres of existence that defy the limitations of the physical world. But why were such ideas persecuted or censored? Perhaps because recognizing the possibility of multiple realities or alternative dimensions would call into question the Church's monopoly on truth. If there are other worlds, other lives, other chances, what would be the role of traditional religious institutions? Ezra, with his bold vision, may have planted the seeds of a spiritual revolution that the elites preferred to stifle before it germinated. This new earth, then, is not just a distant promise. It is an invitation to explore our own perception of reality and seek answers beyond the obvious. But, of course, this brings us to an even bigger question. If there are parallel worlds or hidden dimensions, who or what inhabits these places? Ezra, in his texts, presents an intriguing and, for many, uncomfortable vision of salvation. He writes of a chosen people, a nation destined to be an exclusive covenant with God. But what exactly does this exclusivity mean? Was Ezra reinforcing Israel's spiritual supremacy? Or was there a deeper layer of symbolism in this idea? For a contemporary society grappling with issues of inclusion, Ezra's thinking provokes both fascination and controversy. In the historical context, Ezra was dealing with a people recently left exile, who were desperately seeking to rebuild their identity. The idea of a chosen people was a powerful psychological and political resource. It served to unite Jews under the same spiritual banner, while at the same time differentiating them from the surrounding nations. However, this exclusivity also raised a delicate question. What about the others? What would happen to those who were not part of this divine pact? Ezra does not leave much room for doubt. In his words, there is a strong tone of separation, of distinction between the sacred and the profane, the chosen and the excluded. This vision, despite its effectiveness in consolidating a group, also creates divisions that reverberate to this day. After all, if salvation is limited to a single group, what does that say about the universal character of God? This tension between exclusivity and universality is not just a theological problem. It is a dilemma that crosses cultures and religions throughout history. But there is another angle to consider. Some scholars suggest that the idea of a chosen people can be understood in a more symbolic way. Perhaps Ezra was speaking of an attainable spiritual state, where any individual who sincerely sought the truth could become part of this people. This aligns with esoteric traditions, which often use the term elect to refer to those who reach a higher level of consciousness. This interpretation, however, is exactly the kind of knowledge that religious institutions would prefer to keep from the public. So what did Ezra really mean? Was he defending an exclusive theology or pointing to a broader and more universal spiritual path? Either way, his words continue to resonate, forcing us to face our own divisions and prejudices. And of course, getting ready for where we explore how Ezra relates the shortening of time to theories about the speeding up of days, a concept as mysterious as it is disturbing. Among the most intriguing passages in Ezra, a prophecy about the shortening of the days stands out as a mystery that transcends epochs. He writes that time would be shortened in the last days, a statement that many interpret as an apocalyptic vision. But what exactly does this mean? Was it a metaphor for the human perception of time or a literal statement about cosmic manipulation? And more importantly, how does this resonate in the modern era where so many claim that time seems to be speeding up? In the historical context, Ezra lived in a world in transition. Exile had destroyed not only Israel's national identity, but also its perception of the future. Time, for him, was not just a linear sequence, but a force that could be shortened or extended by God himself. Interestingly, this idea is not exclusive to Judaism. Esoteric and Gnostic traditions often mention the compression of time as a sign of spiritual transformation or impending catastrophe. Could it be that Ezra, consciously or not, was accessing forbidden knowledge about the nature of time? Modern science, with its understanding of relativity, brings a new layer to this discussion. If time is relative, as Einstein taught us, could it be possible that Ezra was referring to a literal change in temporal structure? Or was he observing something more subjective, a perception of a rapidly changing world, where events seem to occur at an increasingly frantic pace? In both interpretations, his prophecy finds resonance in our age, where technological advances and global crises make each day shorter, at least in our minds. The symbolism behind the shortening of time is also fascinating. Ezra seemed to suggest that this change was a warning, a sign that something monumental was about to happen. For many, this is the essence of the apocalypse, not just the end, but the revelation of something new. If he was right, perhaps we are living on the threshold of a transformative event. And of course, this raises another question. Who manipulates time? God, cosmic forces, or even beings that operate beyond our understanding? In the end, Ezra leaves us with a provocation. Time, this apparently immutable flow, can be much more malleable than we imagine. And if it's shortening, what does that mean for us? This question leads us straight ahead, where we will explore the role of Ezra in the prophecies about the Antichrist, a reading that promises to be as controversial as it is revealing. Ezra, known for his apocalyptic visions, left a trail of enigmas about the future of humanity. Among them, there are clues that many interpret as references to the emergence of a shadowy figure, the Antichrist. But while traditional theology paints this figure as the ultimate enemy, Ezra seems to offer a different and, perhaps, disturbing perspective. Did he see the Antichrist as an agent of chaos or as a necessary piece on the great divine board? In the most enigmatic passages of the fourth book of Ezra, we find mentions of a leader who will rise in the last days, defying God himself. The description, although vague, bears parallels with later New Testament narratives about the Antichrist. However, the historical context of Ezra suggests something more complex. He lived in a time of authoritarian leaders, where politics often became intertwined with religion. Could it be that his prophecy was, in fact, a veiled criticism of these rulers who placed themselves above the divine order? And there is more. Esoteric and Hermetic traditions often portray shadowy figures not only as destroyers, but as catalysts for transformation. Ezra's Antichrist, if interpreted through this lens, could be less a villain and more an agent of the chaos necessary to spark renewal. It's a vision that challenges dogma, but resonates with the idea that good and evil are intrinsically linked, each giving meaning to the other. Another fascinating question is why the Church chose to ignore or marginalize these passages from Ezra, perhaps because they suggest a God who not only allows evil to exist, but who can even use it as a tool. This type of thinking destabilizes the traditional view of a purely benevolent and omnipotent divine. The knowledge contained in these texts, excluded and persecuted, raises questions that many would prefer to leave untouched. And then we come to the central provocation. If the Antichrist, according to Ezra, is an inevitable part of the divine plan, what does this mean for humanity? Are we destined to face this figure as a final test, or is it simply a reflection of our own failures and divisions? Whatever the answer, Ezra leaves us with more questions than answers, preparing us for a rather intriguing question: his possible connections to the legendary Library of Alexandria and the lost knowledge that could change everything. The legendary Library of Alexandria is for many the greatest symbol of the loss of ancient knowledge, a repository where the mysteries of the cosmos, the roots of humanity, and the secrets of spiritual traditions could have been preserved. But what if Ezra, the enigmatic scribe, had a connection to this monument to knowledge? Did part of his lost work, those 70 books he allegedly wrote but never revealed, find shelter among the parchment-filled corridors of Alexandria? Or was this just another piece of a puzzle of mysteries? The idea is not as absurd as it seems. Ezra lived at a time when the ancient world was interconnected by trade and cultural roots. Egyptian and Babylonian influence is clear in his texts, and it would not be surprising to discover that he had access to traditions that went beyond Israel's borders. The Library of Alexandria, with its obsession with collecting all available knowledge, would be the ideal place to preserve Ezra's writings, especially those considered dangerous or forbidden by the religious elite of the time. And here comes the provocation. What if the destruction of the library was not just an accidental tragedy, but a deliberate act to suppress knowledge that challenged the power of dominant institutions? If Ezra's texts contained truths about the origins of evil, hidden dimensions, or the duality of God, they would certainly have been seen as threats. After all, whoever controls knowledge controls the narrative, a lesson that history has repeated countless times. Archaeology and surviving texts offer intriguing clues. Manuscripts found at Nag Hammadi and the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, contain ideas that echo those of Ezra. Were these texts influenced by his visions? Or are they fragments of the same body of knowledge that once rested in Alexandria? It's a mystery that continues to challenge scholars and theologians, suggesting there is much more to discover about the interaction between these ancient worlds. In the end, Ezra leaves us with a question that resonates deeply. What would we do if we found the lost texts, not just from him, but from the entire Library of Alexandria? Would we be prepared to deal with truths that could overturn centuries of dogmas and beliefs? And what could these discoveries tell us about our own spiritual and intellectual potential? And if you stayed this far, be sure to subscribe to the channel and click on the video that appears on the screen, because there will be no shortage of questions and answers that will make you think about what is real or manipulation. Thank you very much, and until next time.